continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. When Human Rights Watch director Ken Roth joined me here in 2017, I asked him bluntly about the long-term prospects for democracy. With the rise of what appears to be a new wave of totalitarianism, we might say fascism, how are we to grapple with this particular moment in our history? That's the question we probed. And he cautioned that was premature. I wouldn't go that far. Let's not call it totalitarianism yet or fascism. I mean, those are the ultimate fears, but today's guest is Shane Burley, and he's crucially and masterfully documented those fears and their reality in his AK Press volume, Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It. And presumably he would disagree with Roth's assessment. No better volume exists to understand the nexus of alt-right bigotry and anti-fascist resistance in the United States than Fascism Today, bringing to bear years of in-depth research and investigation into the resurgence of the far right. That was praise from historian of fascism, Mark Bray. So today, Shane and I will examine the weaponization of the alt-right, hate and full-blown Nazism, the ascension of an indisputably powerful populism that is careening toward massive upheaval, and perhaps a new anti-social order of hate-fueled protests, elections, and governance. Shane, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Alexander.
Is that how you see it, potentially a new anti-social global order?
I think that if we look at the rise of what we call kind of right populism in Europe, and then stateside with Trump, I think there's a rise of something. I think I might actually jump on board with the above quote saying, like, yeah, there was a time when it was a little hyperbolic to say that. We didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, there's always been insurgent far-right movements. We call them insurrectionary white supremacist movements. They kind of skyrocket, but they're always in the minority. They're generally unpopular. What we have now is a little different than that. It's the next step. I call it kind of step two. And we really haven't seen something like that since maybe the Third Era Klan in the 60s or even the Second Era Klan in the 20s, when millions of people were getting involved. This is much larger than something we've had before, and so it has the potential to have that as we head into 2018, 2019.
And you point out, Shane, that the ultimate conquest of fascism is not necessarily totalitarianism.
No, definitely not. I mean, what fascism wants to do is it wants to reinforce the hierarchies that are kind of implicit in society. The unequal things we get in capitalism that we've had historically with white supremacy, with patriarchy and sexism, they want to make those explicit, right? We want to bring back hierarchies, make inequality something that's sanctified rather than something that we kind of push against. At the same time, they want to bring back this essential idea of identity, that white people are something that traces back to, centuries into Europe, that is something spiritual and biological. And so when it's kind of reifying those values, the counter to that in a lot of ways is to reify cosmopolitan left values, to really confront them and say, like, no, we're not going to accept that version of inequality. We're not going to accept inequality to be sanctified in our culture. We're not going to accept this kind of monoracial state that they want to put in.
In your research, what are the differing ideas about what fascism is and what it isn't?
Yeah, there's a lot of competing narratives historically, and a lot of that comes from problems on the left of using the term inappropriately or maybe jumping the gun on it. What fascism does not mean is just a totalitarian state. There are lots of totalitarian states. There's totalitarian Stalinist governments. There's totalitarian, open capitalist governments. There's ones that are, monoracial and multiracial. That's not its defining feature. Its defining feature is what it says about the culture. It's what it kind of values that underlie those decisions. They can make a lot of different political decisions, but when it comes back to that inequality and that identity, that's really the ends up being the core of it.
To test your hypothesis, how can you have a government that is totalitarian and not fascist? What does that look like?
Well, let's look at something like the Soviet states. There's a lot of problems there. There's a certain type of party elite at the top. There's definitely a lot of lying in the media, state-run media that's dishonest. There's heavy imprisonment rates. All of those are problematic. I don't think anyone's going to defend those things. But is there motivating factors, the idea that human beings are unequal and that we have to drive out certain kinds of undesirables? That is a really different fundamental idea. And what we come back to is metapolitics, and that's really what's at play here. Is the ideas that come before politics. What are the values that motivate politics down the line? And that's really where fascism kind of enters, and that's really where the alt-rights entered, is that they want to challenge the basic assumptions of kind of post-Enlightenment countries. The idea that human beings are created equal, the idea that everyone should have a voice in politics, that mass politics is important, that an elite liberal case, or at least kind of a ruling caste is not important. All of those things are being challenged at the fundamental ideas of values, with all the things that come before people make those political choices.
But I'm confused, so tell me why the current Putin Russia is fascist, or is it not?
I think it's debatable.
Because you were saying pre-Putin Soviet era, maybe the Yeltsin. I'm just saying the way in which Putin exploits identity politics in the way that is comparable to Trump.
Right. I think we could say that it's definitely a far-right totalitarian regime. I don't think that's really in dispute. The question is, does he go as far as to say, well, you know what, this is a politic about white people, explicitly. And you know what, the non-white people, they're just simply not as equal. If that's really the step that openly fascist governments take. And those are the steps that openly fascist politics take. Now there's a mass politic that they kind of ride a wave in. Trump might be part of that, where you use dog whistles, you talk about immigrants instead of people of color. Those are the kinds of things that you make the step into open politics. But until you're there, it's more of the far right-wing totalitarianism, and it hasn't quite gotten here. I think the point is we don't want it to get to that step. We want to kind of kill it in utero.
And I do want to ask you for your ideas on how to avert the second coming or third coming of that American fascism. But it occurred to me just now hearing you speak is kind of the battle of these fascists or wannabe fascist leaders. I was thinking of Erdogan in the same spirit as a Putin, but yet when Trump and Israel want to move the capital of Israel, Erdogan says, not so fast. So is he really in alignment with the Trump and Putin brand of white ethno-fascist identity?
I guess there isn't really perfect alignment, and you can't expect there to be, And
then you kind of have to see, well, who really is going to favor the liberal versus illiberal democracy?
There really isn't a prescription here that we know in advance exactly how this is going to turn out. So if we look at Europe, I think that's a good analogy in a lot of ways. Their party politics are certainly different. They have far-right parties that run for office, sometimes get in some seats. But in a lot of ways, a lot of their movements do run similar. UKIP or the Front National in France, almost winning really major elections there. So there's a big turn. At the same time, there's a response that's coming in. And it's debatable whether that response is going to win. If they're able to really challenge the underlying assumptions of those parties, if they're really able to say, you know what, no, we're actually going to confront anti-immigrant or Islamophobic bigotry, we're not just going to kind of temper the rhetoric on that, then I think you'll see something that's really successful because they have to provide a real alternative. And that's going to be the truth here. So if, for example, party leaders, Democrats or Republican, are challenging Trump, but they're doing it in soft-pedaled ways, that's not really going to it's not going to really confront the underlying Trumpism that's really taken hold, the populist anger that's really happening in the American working class.
So a populist anger and uprising against, one of the definitions in your book, and let me point out for our viewers that you have this really illuminating glossary of key terms that is a preamble, in effect, to your book, which I think would be so edifying to people to learn about how this identity is manifest today.
Right.
One of them is globalism. And you describe here It's a right-wing interpretation of the effects of globalization, usually indicating the negative effects of multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism. For the anti-globalist, this could mean the destruction of ethnic identity, traditional, familial, or gender roles, the dominance of traditional authority or the church, the destruction of interpersonal relationships, and so on. And then you go on to differentiate it between the left-wing anti-globalization.
Right.
Because the and so on is the part I want to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
The and so on is the economic conditions that have perpetuated inequity across American society today. So, root cause of the current wave of Charlottesville-like Klan uprising.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is it's the economy is stupid. The problem is that the economy is not really the motivating factor in a lot of these cases. It's an intersecting force. I mean, one is that we actually have economic issues going back 40 years of neoliberalism, that there's a real instability, a permanent instability that's happening in the economy. We're talking about in Middle America, we're talking about Appalachia, we're talking about in the South. And so there's a real angst, and it's coming at the same time that companies are going global, right? We're talking about multinationals going across borders, trading across borders and suppressing wages both in this country and other countries. At the same time, they're crushing labor unions, they're crushing benefits and wages, contingency workforces are taking over. So we're talking about a very tumultuous area. But at the same time, people's actual embedded racism is being challenged. The country is changing. That's just a fact. People's values are changing. LGBT people are being, that's coming up front in people's minds.
That's coming up front in people's minds is
Right.
important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because while it's not the determining factor in people's livelihoods or lives and their worth, it's coming up on people's minds. Just I wanted to ask you what you mean by that.
Well, I think about people, I'm a millennial, I guess you'd say, or people younger than me.
Yeah.
People my age, this isn't an issue, right? This is not something that's really up for debate. And even we're talking about young conservatives even, it's really not an issue that's up for debate. But you're asking someone over the age of 50, especially in those parts of the country, this is something that they're actually struggling with.
And if you're asking people online, they're really struggling with it. And that's the key to your book.
Yeah. I mean, there was a certain id that was unleashed by a lot of these kind of 4chan, 8chan web forums, and places like Breitbart and Rebel Media really picked up on this and created a whole financial media infrastructure out of it. And so what they were able to do is to tap into a very real anger, give it a certain anonymity, and just let it loose. And that really fueled what ended up happening with the alt-right because it basically merged with open white nationalism. I mean, and that change is not something that we've had before. We didn't have a media infrastructure like this before. We didn't have the internet. You used to have to, if you were in a white supremacist organization, you publish a paper, you try and get a mail list, things like that. It costs a lot of money. But now you can start a WordPress blog for maybe $1,000 of some promotion. And we're talking about very major influencers and conversations online.
That's why the idea of open web is disturbing. When Zuckerberg envisioned opening society, connecting us to what? Connecting us to what? And the reality of the internet experience today is it's opening us or people up to some incredibly malevolent forces that are antisocial, anti-Semitic. You write about Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing and the way in which the alt-right, the openly nationalistic folks who were sympathizing with McVeigh, how they operated.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't today's media give the extremists more opportunity to organize than in the mid-90s? I mean,
without question, infinitely more. I mean, it's not even the same situation.
It's a different world.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the constituencies are different. I mean, this used to be, largely lower working class rural areas that were hit very hard. And then in urban areas, we're talking about things like skinhead gangs. It was a much different culture. The alt-right, not so much. Upper middle class kids, universities, well-to-do parents that are basically having kind of these traditional white supremacist narratives reinforced online. And so it's given them an infinitely better ability to organize, to be able to publish material, to be able to get really serious about their ideas in a way, to really argue for these ideas, to really argue that anti-Semitism is a conscious, smart choice, that white people should should be rid of people of color, that kind of thing. This is something that's come forward in a way that we haven't quite seen in them, at least in the last 60 years, not to this degree and not this openly.
In effect, it's like the eugenics movement bought the internet.
Oh, absolutely. And then was fueled by, venture capital. Because, this makes a lot of money. Breitbart, clickbait makes a lot of money. And it's not to say that Breitbart really is the open white nationalism. It's not so much. It just kind of panders to that crowd. It kind of helps lead people in that direction.
What % of that eugenics movement is authentic? What % of it is profiteering off of bots and trolls?
I think the people at, like I talk about, open alt-right figures, Richard Spencer and the National Policy Institute, places that argue things like race and IQ connections, those people are incredibly sincere, and there's a lot of them.
They're sincere in their conviction that white people are superior.
Oh, without question. And this is not a new...
I'm just wanting the audience to
absolutely, absolutely. Or in some cases that we need mass genocide to rid ourselves of non-white people. That's an open argument that's being made, debated on these websites. There's essays that try and cite sources. They use great footnoting to try and argue this. And so, this is the kind of thing that's incredibly sincere, and it's creating a movement of people that are really committed to what's essentially a revolutionary politic. It's not just going to take place in the voting booth. It's something that would really have to unseat the entire, American government and states to reinforce their vision. Then there's the Breitbart medias of the world, and I think in a lot of ways, someone like Steve Bannon is a true believer, but at the same time, these whole infrastructures really are built on creating kind of a tabloid journalism. In the same way that, we used to accuse Fox News of doing it, Breitbart does it better.
Well, now you say in the title of your book, Fascism Today, what it is and how to end it.
Right.
So it sounds like there is a seamless and unstoppable flow of what has been proven some mis and disinformation. But now what is proven in your book and other accounts of bigotry.
Well, I think that the first thing is that we really do have to step outside our comfort zone a little bit on this. We can't expect well-reasoned debates to work on this. They work outside of our frame of reference. When you're arguing something like human inequality, I believe human beings just simply aren't created equal. That's not something that's just an issue of normal debate. It's not like I present an argument, you present an argument, and we walk away from it. Instead, it's really a competing worldview that kind of goes far, far past just simple arguments. And so in a lot of ways, what needs to happen is communities need to have concerted efforts to refuse these people, refuse them access to platforms, to refuse them access to the community spaces, basically to challenge them directly. It really does have to be somewhat of an organized battle in that way.
Does that apply to Charles Murray?
I think that Charles Murray was Breitbart before Breitbart was clickbait. Charles Murray openly advocates pseudoscience, eugenic arguments that really does present black Africans as being less natively smart than white people. That right there is a genocidal argument. It's saying that one group of people has less worth and is more disposable, and more than that, that the crimes and the persecution that they face in a lot of ways is because of their innate intelligence.
But he's not unwilling to understand that context.
I mean, he's certainly willing to soft pedal his language and nod along with people, and
Is there malice there?
Oh, absolutely.
What leads you to think that?
Well, I mean, for one, look at the bell curve itself. And if you look at the research, when you go through, he's citing things like Pioneer Fund studies. And the Pioneer Fund maybe sounds like a nice academic think tank, But what they've done is they funded the neo-Nazi movement for decades, and specifically to try and prove that specifically black people are genetically inferior to white people and Asians, and that they should be treated different, and they should be suspect, especially black men, because they're criminals, they have no sexual control, they're after white women, all of that. And so what Charles Murray does is essentially legitimize those arguments, put an academic veneer off it, make a killing off of it, and then sell it back to the universities.
When it comes down to the fact that we do have the Wild West of the internet online, and we need to have some measures that acknowledge actors that are clearly malicious because of the way they're articulating their message, and that is denigrating a race, a religion, a people, shouldn't those be the targets of an intervention against contemporary bigotry?
I mean, I think those are the targets of intervention. I think Charles Murray is. One of the things that defines the alt-right is its use of pseudo-academia. You know, this isn't just Charles Murray, it's American Renaissance. It's a long list of academics and researchers that try and back up those claims. So yes, Charles Murray is maybe the most public example, you know, the recent Campus Anti-Fascist Network protest of him. But he comes in a long line of people that make those arguments that people like Andrew Anglin and the Daily Stormer basically weaponize. And so I don't think it's good enough to just go over the sharp, you know, tip of the spear on this. You really have to go at the underlying arguments, because what they're doing is attempting to transform the culture to get people to think differently and to think that this kind of targeting of people of color is all right.
Well, the most damaging thing, to my mind, has been Google's indexing of publications that are blatantly anti-Semitic or blatantly racist or blatantly bigoted.
Yeah,
that is target number one.
Well, I mean, it's what they've really worked hard is to mimic academia, mimic journalism, to do these things in kind of a parody form, but to do them really well. I mean, the Daily Stormer, for example, you know, an open neo-Nazi website that used to have a banner that said the #1 pro-genocide website on the internet, would get hundreds of thousands of page hits. You know, these were not small publications. The Daily Shoah, for example, named after the Holocaust, haha, isn't that funny? 100,000 listeners every couple of weeks. These are really, really huge things. And yeah, since Charlottesville, we were seeing mass platform denial. You know, their web hosting's gone, their podcast hosting's gone, they're even kicked off Tinder. You know, they're being kind of booted off of these spheres. But what they have done is they've used Web 2.0 platforms to essentially be on the same, infrastructure that regular journalists, politicians, and so on are.
What is the most effective way to use your words, to boot them off the sphere?
To stand up to them. I mean, if they're, for example, I'm out in Portland, for example, they have these quote-unquote free speech rallies, right? Obviously, if you were to ever read into these alt-right publications, free speech is as far from what they want as they could get, but it's a really great talking point for them. And what happens in those situations is the community comes out in force and just disallows it to go on. We're talking about a few radicals and black mass. We're talking about 4,000 people in the city descending on their rally and basically making it untenable. Basically, in Boston, shortly after Charlottesville, there was going to be a rally about 150 Proud Boys and other alt-right people. 40,000 people came out. You know, this is, your grandma, this is your neighbor. Everyone's coming out in refusal. That mass action, that mass confrontation, that's really what has shut this down. And it's done it historically and for decades.
Well, there's no historical precedent right now for the masses to shut down the indexing, though. That is the central dilemma right now.
Right.
I mean, I disagree with you about the most effective response to an alt-right speaker, depending upon whether or not, if they're engaged in overt political violence, they shouldn't be there. You know, but
I think we should be clear.
You can't stand up to a search algorithm. One person and millions of people have not proven effective yet in responding to the alt-right flurry of activity in the indexing of Google search results.
So I mean, Google is one thing, but let's talk about the mass platform denial. We're talking about Cloudflare, we're talking about iTunes, Stitcher, we're talking about almost every web publishing
and that's a
platform.
Positive development.
I mean, but it's so massive that they actually aren't on the same playing field anymore. I mean, it's been so demonstrable at this point that they're not able to reach out their message, that they're starting to have a shrink and a little bit of retreat, at least in that public messaging. That's part of what's moving them out into the streets more.
As far as I know, there's not a foolproof way that Google has disallowed them, has uninvited them, that sporadically these sites still come up on.
Sure. And I think that's also an issue of the fact that we have something like Google that dominates communication. One single company has the ability of setting that trend. But I think what's happening too is that this mass platform denial hasn't happened in a vacuum. It hasn't actually happened just because of the alt-right's own behavior. Organized activists put campaigns on to pressure companies to do what was right and kick people that are advocating for violence off of there. That's the same thing that has to happen here. It has to be part of an organized, concerted strategy of organizations doing the work.
There are a couple groups in particular, Sleeping Giants, Indivisible, that have championed those values in response to the resurgence of hate. In particular, Sleeping Giants.
Sure. But I think there's also groups that have gotten less coverage and have been doing it for years. You know, there's been a lot of, coverage of Antifa, whatever, different media outlets seem to think that means. But a lot of those organizations
we need to discuss this. We just have very limited time now. But Antifa.
Yeah.
they've been marginalized as an effective vehicle to countering Trump's agenda.
Yeah, right.
Because the images of them showing up at some of these rallies are just as disturbing to folks as the tiki tortures. That is the reality, especially when they're dressed in all black. So how do you move beyond the Antifa concept that, in the opinions of most Americans, they're either unknown or unfavorable?
I would actually challenge that a little bit. And I think in the opinions of most Americans, it's not necessarily unfavorable. And we're seeing
more
that because,
unknown.
Yeah, it could be unknown, you know. Antifa, the word, tends to mean the militant anti-fascist tradition, ones where people who are protesting anti-fascist or fascist groups are willing to confront them directly and disallow space. They're not really unwilling to take that next step, right, of confrontation. And that really comes out of interwar period when people are facing real lived violence, or then going up into the 70s and the 80s in UK and Germany, when we're seeing the rise of fascist parties that were actually targeting people of color, especially immigrants. And so there was actually a real relevant need for that. And so, yeah, right-wing media loves to pick up on a person in a mask. It sure does look scary in those photos. But the reality is that those are the people defending undocumented people at protests, or defending women and LGBT people who are under attack from far-right groups. And so I think it's important to not just double back and say, oh, well, we really need to just change the image of that. Some of that has really been built out of the necessity of the threat that a lot of these groups pose.
Shane, I would contend you have to change not the imagery, the lexicon, the vocabulary, the strategy. Anti-law and order works. Anti-fascist, or at least the way Antifa is going, doesn't work. I'll give you the last word to quote maybe your favorite Fox News personality.
I think 40,000 people in Boston would disagree with you. I think the tens of thousands of people coming out in protests that completely overwhelm the alt-right and completely overwhelm any of the far right-wing kind of sympathizers would completely disagree
Did Mayor
with that.
Walsh give the same opportunity that the Virginia authorities did in terms of permits? Were they... Because it's not just about the protesters, it's about the mayors and the elected officials saying that this is not proper use of public funds or public security apparatus, and just simply not grant a permit to a politically violent group.
I mean, I think the issue is something like permits avoids what the really core issue is. Permits or no permits, these groups come out and they will be opposed when they come out, right? And so whether or not we're appealing to liberal politicians to kind of participate in that, I think is almost like a tangential issue.
The Bostonians were saying, though, that those KKK folks, they don't believe in law and order. That's my point.
I mean, I think in the broader sense, I think what they're saying is they don't believe in values of equality and democracy.
If you think that law and order is intended or designed to enshrine those values, we'll have to continue that the next time. Shane, thanks for coming here from Portland.
All right, thanks for having me on.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.